Okay, welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, March 22nd. My name is Heather Kraus, and I am the founder of an organization called We All Count, which is an organization that focuses on equity in data. And welcome to Talking Data Equity. Talking Data Equity is an informal drop-in gathering that we host most Fridays at this time. And the idea behind Talking Data Equity, why we do this, is that after a couple of years of training and consulting on data equity, one of the things we figured out is that it's really easy to feel like you're the only person working on this or the only person that cares. So we wanted to create a space where you could come on an informal basis and realize that you are not alone. You are not the only person that's working on this. And at the same time, get some new ideas, get some new inspiration for how you could increase the equity in the data work that you do. And Talking Data Equity is a little bit different every single Friday. And sometimes we talk about a technique or an issue that's of interest. Sometimes we have special guests. Today, we have a very, very exciting special guest. And right before I introduce our special guest, let me just give 30 seconds of logistics. This is run as a Zoom meeting, so that means you have control over your own video and your own microphone. We ask that you keep your microphone turned off while our special guest is sharing their stories and their slides. Feel free to use the Zoom chat at any time. You can put questions, put comments, put conversation into the Zoom chat at any time. And then once our special guest is done sharing their slides and their stories, that's when you'll have an opportunity, if you're in the room, to raise your hand, turn your mic on, and ask questions directly. Okay, so having said that, let me introduce you to our very, very special guest. I am so excited to let you know that Dr. Lina Zigelyte has found time in her very busy schedule to spend an hour with us. Lina has over 10 years of experience working as a tech consultant for nonprofits in healthcare, in arts, in early stage startups. And right now, she's supporting user experience research at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Society in New York. And Lena has a PhD in visual and cultural studies from the University of Rochester and spent 5 years teaching social sciences and visual studies classes across different colleges and universities in Western New York. And I came across Lena's work when I read the recently published book, Queer Data Studies. And I highly recommend you check this book out. She has a fantastic chapter in it. Most of her scholarly work studies the relationships between transnational media history and sexuality studies. And right now, she makes her home in Western New York with her wife and her dog. But before that, she lived in Ireland, the Netherlands, and Lithuania, where she was born. So enough from me. I will now turn it over to Lina. And Lina, thank you so much for making time in your schedule to come share your really cool stories with us.
Thank you, Heather, for the introduction. So let me maybe just add one more thing. So if you feel like connecting with me, hopefully the next half an hour, 45 minutes will encourage to do that. Feel free to just go on LinkedIn. Just clarification: Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center is where I work right now. You can look them up. I know there is several of you who work in healthcare. I'm really a little bit intimidated by the by the degree of knowledge and wealth of experience that people bring to these sessions. So it's a huge honor to be here, and I'm really grateful for the invitation, Heather. Yeah, starting with a thank you, and then I hope to share some slides in the next maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then afterwards open this up for a Q&A. I've been really inspired by a number of past sessions that I watched recordings of. I'm glad we're recording this. I do have a lingering cough, so just bear with me if that comes up. And yeah, quite a bit of actually of this work builds on what a couple months ago was presented by Kevin Gayan in a talk on queer data and their book on queer data. So I hope this sort of continues the conversation. And like Heather mentioned, the next, half an hour or so is sort of my way of building on that conversation and drawing primarily on a chapter that I wrote for this collection of essays. Do check it out via your local bookseller or your library. It really has a lot of great contributions to the larger discussion on what queer data means right now in 2024 and what questions the field is tackling presently, what questions maybe we should be asking. And I'm sort of starting with this a quote by the editor of the collection, Patrick Kelty. As a way to sort of, begin my today's talk, and my hope is that the insights I share are applicable, practical enough also to very different roles and contexts and teams and disciplines that you represent. So when we talk about queer data, here are some knowledge categories where queer data plays out. Injustice might be the obvious place to start, if you like. Isn't this why data might be collected by nonprofits, government agencies on discrete demographic groups, so that we can make data-informed decisions on better access to healthcare, to housing, to education, or other things that improve the quality of people's lives? And this data from Project 538, perhaps a little more familiar to those from the US context, this is from their publication in 2019, and it actually shows the data they cite. The PRRI is the Public Religion Research Institute. This really shows that we've come a long way in terms of public storytelling about queer data. And queer data, in the sense, is sort of the larger constellation of various aspects of lives that don't fall within the cis heteronormative frame, if you like. So take a look at this, and any keen eye observing this chart will notice a bit of a setup, if you like, because the question about the perceived discrimination of LGBT people actually invites respondents to think of gays and lesbians as a category separate from Black Americans or women or Jewish Americans. In academic terms, one might say there's lack of intersectionality in the approach here. Yet, an even more interesting question to ask when we look at an example of queer data in this context is, so what? So what if we learn about the perception of LGBT people among Americans? Who does this knowledge serve? And how does this knowledge serve LGBT people? But hang on a minute, in the chart, it is just L and G. The B and T drop. We have the headline, but in the chart, the B and T drop. One might add drop again. It's fairly common for those two letters to drop in larger inquiries about LGBTQ plus experiences. And how did LG morph into gays and lesbians in the chart? And yes, I'm being very picky here, but the devil is in the details. And I'm simply thinking, what wisdom are we trying to get to here? And how did we get to crushing data 5 years later that a third of queer youth in the US do not expect to live past the age of 35? Was there something we perhaps did not count earlier on? So this crushing number could be lower, or so that today we would not need to ask young queer people if they think they will live past the age of 35. Data on queer representation. In the larger media landscape, one way to think about it is about the possibilities of slicing and dicing what we see coming at us from the larger media landscape, right? Consider the Vito Russo test that next time you watch a film with a queer character, those perhaps who have not heard the name, Vito Russo was a very prolific film scholar who died from AIDS in the 90s. And his really influential book called The Celluloid Closet has become also a documentary. It's brilliant, and it actually speaks to our day, even after 30 years of after publication. So the Vito Russo test, right? Another way of thinking of what has changed in the larger representation of queer existence and experiences. Is there an evidently LGBTQ character? Do we learn anything else about the character than them being LGBT? And what if that character suddenly disappears? What if they disappear? Does the story carry on, or does it collapse? These are basic ways of slicing and dicing the Vito Russo test for representation in film. And while the overall volume of films and TV shows with queer characters is evidently rising, at least that's sort of, the larger discourse, if you like, visual scholars have been warning us for a long time about the traps of cookie cutter characters and mainstreaming of palatable queer representation. And we could go further in terms of data points to ask, what kind of world does the film production set represent? Who is there? Who writes the script? Who directs? Who produces? Who sits in the board meetings where business decisions are being made? How has this data changed? Which data on representation is the most meaningful, and how might we present that? Or, if we shift gears altogether, and as our next opportunity for storytelling, again, this is perhaps a context more familiar to those in the US, our next opportunity for storytelling um, might be if we look at the current book banning as another opportunity for queer data to act. What if we highlight not the books or the topics banned, but the most committed sponsors of book banning campaigns in the US and the most vocal parent groups and the number of books on Christian characters at libraries of our so-called secular public schools? And so we arrive at feelings as another way of thinking about queer data. 40,000 panels of the AIDS Memorial quilt at the National Mall in 1996. And then 20 years later, this is a hand of one of my former students, 15 students at the special collections at the University of Rochester carefully touching one of the panels at a class that I taught. Things. We could already see them across the AIDS Memorial quilt panels, personal photographs and letters and cards, like this one from my native Vilnius in Lithuania. Things that might hold queer history, like the ties at a historically lesbian cafe in Amsterdam. You can see them sort of in the top left corner of the photograph. Rumor has it that the ties would be cut off if a man walked into a space. So many queer things, yet so few museums dedicated to truly expansive queer history and storytelling that uses queer data and all of its possibilities. And this is one of such museums, one of the few such museums in Berlin, Schwules Museum. And of course, places where queer people live and outlive in spite of it all. And perhaps this is one example that some of you may have come across recently. The project Queering the Map actually originated in 2017 in Montreal, in Canada. with the idea of sort of mapping the experiences and the voices of queer people in Montreal first, and then it started growing and expanding. Linguistically, this is still very much dominated by English language as sort of a connector, perhaps as a tissue, as a way for various cultures to sort of understand each other. But again, that takes away the opportunities to acknowledge the linguistic nuances that might come when it comes to speaking about queerness in non-Anglo-American cultures. And some of you may have also seen the recent efforts to amplify the voices of Palestinians on this map, and to remind that queer people exist in multiple parts of the world. So this introduction was mostly a way of inviting us to think of the ways queer data can bring out meaning, not because of accumulation or scaling, right? We need more data, the larger imperative, but because of connection making. And in a curious way, I sort of, come back to this very classic framework for those maybe of you who have been working in the data science world longer, and dealing with larger knowledge management, right? The really kind of classic pyramid, how we get from raw data points to wisdom. And I've asked before, right? What wisdom does X queer data lead us to? And this longing for connection making is truly the origin story of the case around which my chapter in the queer data studies volume is designed, where I discuss an interactive map and you see a glimpse of it. You're actually, with this image, you're landing in the capital of Lithuania, Vilnius, where I'm from. And it was designed, I conceived and launched this map with the help of several people in 2013. It is no longer extant as an online project, just a heads up if you start looking. And it was made during a year I spent in Lithuania for family reasons. I am primarily based in the US. I have been here since 2010. And this essentially started as an outcome of me recording conversations with local queer people and essentially gathering oral history, if you like, whereby I asked those queer people I knew and those who introduced me to more queer people. There's always a domino effect. What places stand out to them as memorable when it comes to Vilnius and when it comes to their lives. And I also started recording ambient sounds from the locations that were brought up in the conversations. There's about 30 of them presently. And I have about 15 hours of recordings that are also recordings of ambient sounds from the locations that were described. Some of those locations are obviously no longer extant, and it's not just physical places like bars and cafes, but also some parks have shrunk, trees have been cut down, buildings have been built. So the landscape really has changed just in the past decade. I learned of archival materials as part of this work, such as local past gay publications from the early 1990s. And there were dozens of emails as part of this project. Some people that I was emailing with actually are no longer with us. I took photographs of a number of locations that came up in conversations: parks, churches, cafes, restaurants, libraries, locations with former regular parties going back to the early 90s. And just to give you a snippet, I demoed it with Heather just a second ago, and it was working. There's just sort of, the oral experience that you're exposed to as you're exploring this map. Let's hope this works.
Tik dabar neatsimenu kažkokio vieno vakarėlio. Neatsimenu net ir pirmo vakarėlio, taip ryškiai, bet man atrodo 19 dedama buvo. Tai jo, ta erdvė, ta prasme, buvo visai, aš neįsivaizduoju, kaip ją būtų galima atrasti kitaip negu kad per atsitiktinės kažkokias pažintis. Man draugės papasako apie draugės, kurios ten buvo, žodžiu, organizavo ir taip gavosi kažkoks labai toks labai neskausmingas susipažinimas su bendruomenė tuomet, nes, nu, žinai, kai 19, abejoju, nežinai, čia baigus mokyklą, tik, žinai, tai kažkaip, man atrodo, labai pasisekė, ta prasme, susipažinti su gerais žmonėm, kurie iš karto, žinau, tapo draugais. Ir tai jo, ta aktorių namų erdvė dabar pagalvojus, ne tikrai labai keista buvo. Bet tada tai...
So this is a fragment of
Tik
one,
dabar
one
neatsimenu
of the many conversations I had. And the idea of this project is really very simple. To create a way of experiencing the city through the richness and particularities of local queer lives. So I walked you through this process as sort of a way of really asking what did I learn from this process and this experience of working with queer data, in this case in the context of Eastern Europe, but I hope it translates to other parts that you might be connecting to, other parts of the world. And this is how really I get to this idea of toolkits for working with queer data, toolkits for perhaps working creatively with queer data, creative toolkits. The term is really not mine. Some of you may have encountered it in the work of Sarah Ahmed. That's someone whose work really has been very inspirational for me, for my practice and thinking. Toolkit, right, is a simple set of things that will end up or might end up being useful. So my chapter really ends with sort of 7 simple items, if you like, as those toolkits, and I highlighted 4 of them for this audience, and that's really what I would like, where I would like to wrap up. So here are some examples. Beginning with data inventory, right, when it comes to working with queer data. Catherine D'Ignazio, who's a really brilliant scholar of sort of information science, has done a lot of creative work, co-authored a book called Data Feminism, highly recommend. So there's a term there used, data biographies. What was our journey to a particular data set or to a particular topic even? Can we maybe draw a mental map? Let's say if places are mentioned there, do those places still exist? How do we source data? What is our journey into a particular data set, if you like? Is it something that we perhaps, regret not asking if we were in the position to be designing a certain study? Did we have any setbacks in the process, right? How might we make room for these type of questions? So that's sort of what I mean by data inventory. And that was really my first lesson from working on this project. And this is also a bit of a pitch, by the way, if some of you work on spatial data, or perhaps on mobile or mobile apps, maybe you want to help me revive this project. I have ideas I would like to discuss with you. So let's maybe see if we can connect. But that's sort of where these lessons are coming from really kind of hands-on practical work that I'm describing. Another component of this toolkit, labor. Right. I believe the question of labor will increasingly start haunting us. Anyone who works in the larger data science world, right, especially with the onset of generative AI, right, who continues to do the very manual components of labor when it comes to data, who does data entry, right? What does that look like? How has that evolved? Who kind of touches the material aspects of data labor? We might even, expand this into, what is happening in the larger ecosystem of data storage centers, right? Who is working there? How our, data projects that often might just live on the desktop and on the monitors, what is sort of the larger context of labor for these projects that we are involved in, and who build skills that advance career. These are, this is an additional set of questions about labor, really, as another very important component of any really work with data. Is almost like an additional data set that becomes a parallel street to the work that we might be doing as data scientists, data managers, analysts. Lesson number 3 from these toolkits, preservation in the digital era. What are the questions we might need to be asking? There's a phrase that media scholar Zeynep Tufekci uses to describe really the current era in which we live, whereby they say we're sort of digital tenants, really. We increasingly don't own the information and the tools, even the outcomes of our work. It lives somewhere in the ephemeral clouds, right? I will never forget the time when I remember I was teaching a class and I asked the students, so we're talking about clouds a lot. This was a class on media studies, cloud storage. I'm going to just put it in the cloud. And I'm like, so like, where's the cloud? And one student is like, in the sky. So, we are sort of, those digital tenants in the skies. And if we don't think about preservation from the get-go, really from the beginning, we might just end up losing very valuable labor, very valuable knowledge. So, what might ensure these days the longevity of our data projects, what that might look like. Even, in the digital world, those of you who might be touching more visual media, that the things like link rot and bit rot are very much real. Our digital files wear out with usage. We might not be able to notice that instantly, but that is just, what it is. So how do we account for these challenges of preservation? Especially, like I said, since we might be touching really, I wouldn't just say, like in this case, I brought up an example that some of the people with whom I was corresponding, they're no longer alive, right? So things are very, whenever we work with queer data, things can really be very, fragile. And how do we really account that as part of the conceptualization, really, of the projects that we might be working on? And the last lesson 4 for today is really, rethinking collaboration, right? There's a lot of ideas for, what collaboration might look like when it comes to working with queer data, getting to it, and then bringing it back to the audiences. But when we bring it back, do we still promote, extraction? Who benefits from those workshops? Are the people who are presenting, are we learning with the audiences that we have invited? Is this a one-off event? Is this something more long-term? Do we just sort of, helicopter into presentations and workshops and then bid farewell and never really come back to the voices and the people that we touched with our work? How might we think of, different frameworks for collaboration, and what it might look like if it is indeed longitudinal? And what resources might we be giving away, right? If those of us who work with data, we often take, right? We do extract, so to speak. But what do we do to make sure that we're also sort of giving away and that there is a bit of a cycle of exchange in our labor? And last but not least, really, how do we promote data exploration without complex tools, so that it is quite simply, more equitable, back to the keyword and of this professional network that we're in right now, right? We all count. How we promote data exploration without really making it too unnecessarily complex when it doesn't need to be. So that's sort of, my thinking about this notion of toolkits, the lessons that are learned from working with queer data. Putting my email, if you would like to get in touch, feel free to do so. And yeah, I think I would be just really delighted if we opened the floor and And I'm curious to hear, what questions might come up or observations as you're sort of diving into this topic. And I probably could stop sharing the screen. Maybe it's not necessary anymore.
Thank you so much, Lina. That was really, really useful. And I appreciate so much you taking the time out of your schedule to share it with us. And I really hope that this inspires many of you to go and find that book. We will put a link up to the places that you can get the book and the recording and all the resources that Lina is sharing and other folks are sharing will be in the We All Count community forum, which is a public space. You don't have to pay money, or it's not a membership site. So don't worry, all of the resources that are being shared are available to you. And Roxanne, hi, go ahead.
Hi, Witchy. I had a quick question. So I work on the Indigenous Data Governance Framework at the City of Toronto, and some of the barriers that we are coming up against is that many Indigenous communities, so First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, don't like to identify or don't identify at all with, let's say, the term Two-Spirit. And many of the consultations so far are they just the ones that we've done so far, but they do identify with Two-Spirit, but then there are some different nations that don't. So how would we collect that information if we do? What do we do? How in, like, let's say a municipality based on the Canadian nation state, procedures and processes, policies and frameworks and so on, what would that look like? Yeah, I guess that's my question. What would that look like?
Oh, I think you might be the person who might be able to answer that question.
No,
What comes to
no.
mind? Let's just
No,
like
it's for you for sure. The question is definitely for you because like you have different insight into the toolkit, right? I don't necessarily like my expertise is not in like an LGBTQ2S plus
mm,
narrative or lens. Mine is an Indigenous lens, but I want to hear like what the other side, what that potentially would look like categorically.
uh, right. Well, um, I'm not sure if I have a very prescriptive answer, if you like, but when you sort of articulate the problem space, I instantly start to think then what is the language that the people use, those who you interview, right? Is there a way to perhaps, shift priorities and really the dictionary that we're using and to maybe start with that? I also have to say that the kind of the very last toolkit in the chapter, so this is like advertising a little bit, is actually about translation, because there's a reason why I showed to you the audio clip in language that is not English. In my experience, I always notice when I create similar moments, let's say in talks or teaching workshops, it just sits differently. That's one. Two, it instantly gets people's attention, even though they don't speak the language and it might sound very foreign. Those who might be working on sort of the nuances of transnational representation and translation as such, as a really kind of conceptual device, they might know there's a phrase from a scholar who Walter Benjamin quoted later. He said, the translation that really sort of sits and sticks is the kind that leaves you with an experience of foreignness, that not everything was translated, that you actually missed out on something. Blanking out on the originator of the quote. Maybe someone on this forum might have that detail. But like maybe it is actually okay to not align all categories and to sort of unify them. Maybe it is okay to actually account for the fact that not even everything can be turned into structured categories, right? Something that is obviously the the nature of data science, part of the reason why, we might be hired to work with data. But I feel like sometimes an asterisk might be the most important part of the sentence, right? And that then leaves, I think, room to precisely account for the, I feel like, when I use the word the damages, but really kind of the legacy of what happens when we actually try to squeeze complexity into clear categories. Not everything can be boiled down to same categories, right? So that's why, I don't know, when you're asking this question, Roxanne, I'm thinking maybe we don't need to come up with like a better or more accurate ontology, if you like. Perhaps that's precisely the work that needs to be done to really to map out that complexity, right? Instead of trying to simplify it. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but these are some of the things that come to my mind.
Yes, and you have my brain going. Thank you so much. I appreciate that a lot.
Thank you.
You're definitely answering the question. That was really a brilliant answer to that question. I really appreciate it, Lina. Is there anyone else who's here in the room that wants to turn their mic on? Hey, Leslie, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. It's good to see everybody. Leslie Wright to her. I really appreciate if there's 7 of these, I can't wait to find the other 7 points in the toolkit. I think a couple of them really struck me was the labor aspect. It's something I think I don't think a lot about. I mean, especially I work at Kaiser Permanente, which is a big health system, but I do a lot of community-based participatory research. And thinking about the labor, one of the things that struck me is like when we do CBPR studies, especially if they're community and academic partnerships, usually the data, often the data entry and the data analysis and the database person, they're often on the university side or the academic side. And we say that often it's because the community doesn't have the ability or they don't want to do it, or so we're saving them that pain, maybe, or however you might want to look at it. But that also takes away the opportunity to build their capacity. So sometimes increasing labor is a way to build capacity for some of the communities, but we don't invest in that. And then that then goes to data preservation and data ownership, because the data lies with the university always. And I was thinking one of my roles is as a community research liaison. So I kind of liaise between the community and the research institution. But like, I'm going to retire soon. So if that link isn't there, what happens to that potential access to that data? So yeah, people die, but people also retire or they leave. And so that just really some things in my mind. And then the other thing I was thinking about was, in terms of labor and AI, it's not exactly related, but I saw the story, I don't know if it was on the news or whatever, talking about Bitcoin, right? Mining for Bitcoin. And it's done in this area where this community where it's super noisy. And it's causing a lot of pain and noise pollution in this community. And I'm thinking about that's not so different than AI mining. And what is it doing to the environment? What is it doing to the jobs that are lost? And so I really appreciate you putting that in a topic like this. It's giving me a lot to think about. And especially if we talk specifically about the queer community, trying to do research in the queer community still is really challenging. So thank you.
Yeah, Leslie, thank you for sharing, your sort of, thought process, what's going on, what this makes you think about. I feel like the same is happening in my mind, you know, when you are talking. And I think it's just so fascinating. It's interesting that kind of the topic of labor stuck with you, and just I'm just sort of thinking about the increasing really opaqueness of the language that is being used to really describe the stuff that technology these days is doing, you know, modeling, deep learning. It's just what's going on? Like, you know, where are we going? And the thing is that once you start digging, it actually a lot of it does bring us back to very material aspects of technology, right? Something that I was reminded of recently. I don't know if anyone was following the news, but it was in the news a couple really, I think just last week, there was a very massive power outage across large parts of Western Africa, the entire continent. And I don't know, some of you might know about the work that Nicole Starosielski has done on sort of the hardware infrastructure of internet. 95% of the world's internet that connects, you know, Estonia and the United States is happening through a very materially undersea cable network. So, which was built by, you know, governments 100 years ago to empower telephony back in its, you know, early days. So we're still very much like relying on not just the hardware, but its maintenance, all that, you know, simple, very material infrastructure. So whatever modeling, scaling, you know, deep diving is going on, we will continue, I think, just being thrown into the very material aspects of what media is. And definitely with, like, you know, what you said about the Bitcoin, I'm not even going there, but I live close to the Finger Lakes region, which has very deep glacial lakes. Means they're very cold, and locals actually really rebelled, for lack of a better word, against plans to build essentially Bitcoin mining facility next to it, because the water would have been used to cool off those massive servers. You know, they're thinking a lot, they're getting very hot, and they need cold water, but fish lives in the same lakes, and the water would be going, you're basically almost bringing you to boiling temperature, and then it goes back to the lake. So very material. So it's not getting built, last I heard. Kudos to the locals. And yeah, just like another very kind of material example of this larger media world in which we live in. I used to teach media classes, so I'm totally like nerding out sometimes. So please shut me up.
Thank you so much.
I'm similar to Leslie. I really enjoyed the labor aspect, and I'm going to be thinking about that a lot more. And nerding out is exactly what we're here for. Nobody's going to ask you to stop nerding out. That's the plan at Talking Data Equity. Is there anybody else in the room that wants to turn their mic on and ask a question? There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll get to, but I also always want to give an opportunity for anybody live who wants to ask a question. All right. There's some great resources about translation. Loved the idea of translation. And let's see. There's a couple of questions. Let me see if I can get a question that is being asked by more than one person. One thing I want to highlight from the text, which isn't a question, but it's a really important comment, especially given the first topic that we discussed in the live Q&A, is that the word two-spirit does not strictly exclusively refer to a gender identity or a sexual orientation. It's a very nuanced word that's going to have different meanings depending on exactly who you are and what your context is. So that's important, because sometimes it does. I mean, Lina, your point of taking all this complexity and forcing it into a couple of nice, neat silos. You kind of said, I don't know if you want to use the word damage. I would absolutely use the word damage. It's, you know, it's cutting off parts of a very vital living thing. So one of the questions that's being asked is, have you seen any mechanisms of accountability around queer data ownership? That's kind of related to what Leslie was saying, like if Leslie does retire and she's really stewarding a large amount of very important data and knowledge, have you seen any kind of mechanisms of accountability about what's going to happen to that? And if you haven't, that's fine. That's a question. Have you seen any?
I think I'm at the point where I would like to hear what maybe others have learned. I think it's always good, one to just sort of
Yeah.
I like examples that inspire and really kind of try to do good. One maybe maybe because of what Leslie brought up in the context of retirement, what just comes up is transgenerational really exchange and loop of data, especially when it comes to back to today's topic, right? Queer data, queer lives, queer experiences. How what's a good way, or like what's what sort of a sustainable way for having that happen, and for just making sure that that cycle kind of continues and lives on, that it not only it doesn't stop with a particular generation, but it kind of carries on. And what will it become? There's different technologies are being used. There's also the formats of the data that we end up sort of having on our hands is different. I was thinking about archives the other day, speaking to some friends, and like my most precious artifact is my inbox, my Gmail. If there is a lot of queer history there, like it's no
Right.
longer like a notebook or a set of notebooks. I mean, I'm also sort of part of those histories. So like what would be a good accountable way for that to pass on, besides just maybe finding there's a setting in the Gmail for where you can leave access to your inbox to a loved one, a family member. Without that, that data doesn't live on.
Right.
It remains Google's or Alphabet's.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I really, really like that idea of considering your inbox as an artifact. It makes me feel less hostile towards my inbox. I like that idea a lot. And in terms of a response that I would give, and Lina, you said you were open to other people's experiences. This is really one of the founding questions that gave birth to We All Count. Some people have heard some of the kind of founding issues, but I once collected a pretty detailed data set of not necessarily personally identifying information as much as nuanced opinions associated with health information and food security information on a community of people who did largely self-identify into the LGBTQ 2S plus community, and immediately became the recipient of many, many incoming requests to use that data. And it made me realize that, there's an untapped potential for some sort of a social organization. Jaron Lanier, who writes books about like the founding of the internet and how we could manage the internet, has the idea that we should form data unions and be actually responsible. Like I would love to see, the thing I tried to do and was not successful, this was a long time ago, was I tried to set up kind of a collective for all the people that had contributed to that data set and say, sure, the local health unit who really, really wanted to look at this data, and they were like, this is the largest sample size of this important group of people that we think exists in the city. you have to let us see it. So I tried to set up a collective where the people whose data it was could A, decide who got to see it, who didn't get to see it, and B, would be financially compensated because it was their labor. Like, not only had they contributed the data, they had lived the lives that made the data worthwhile and interesting. Like, there was longitudinal labor and simply, accumulating the kind of wisdom that you referred to at the beginning. So, yeah. Oh, here's a very interesting question. What is an alternative to reference a transgender male parent? For example, and again, when I'm not putting you on the spot, Lina, you don't have to have a prescriptive answer to this, just an important question, and others here will have ideas. For example, in a medical after visit summary or family health history, we have found it cumbersome to say transgender parent in contrast to the other parent. There's a couple of
And-
suggestions in the chat, but Lina, do you
Right.
want to talk about that?
I'm watching the chat as it's
Yeah.
happening live. I'm also, I work in healthcare. My partner is also
Right.
working in healthcare. So yeah, these questions absolutely come up a lot. Right. I don't know, like, Bobby, going back to your question, it is also just the very fact that we might document a particular data category and attach it to a particular, family and patient history. It also might not necessarily, like, if we do this, where does that get us? Does that mean that, we're perhaps, aspiring to have in general a more, inclusive taxonomy of data for all patients that we might be seeing at a particular organization? Does this remain, an unstructured note, which no one is ever going to find, or it's going to take a very attentive pair of eyes to actually see the nuances of a particular family, only if you go through the unstructured note. I think kind of like these are the thoughts that come to my mind, that just, it's almost like the naming is just the bare minimum to get to that, right? Yes, maybe, just asking the patient, what they would like to be called is a good start. If it is, an unstructured note, but then if that's the bare minimum, then where do we take it as people who, might be working for larger organizations, and we all touch these larger structural changes, even if just like little parts of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, a really thoughtful insight. And I would add that maybe we don't have to indicate the gender of a parent, or I would question, what would be the purpose of indicating which parent was which gender? What exactly are you trying to measure? And if there is a reason, then finding an appropriate, sensitive way to do that would be really good. But there may not be a reason that kind of survives the kind of conventional, heterosexual nuclear family idea. There may not actually be a reason to gender parents at all, or even count parents. We have to leave it there. I know that there are many, many more questions, and we will get to as many as you'd like to ask on the forum. Again, the recording for today, as well as the resources, will be on the forum in the events section in the Talking Data Equity section. And feel free to continue to ask questions there, keep the conversation going. And programming note, next week we are off. Next Friday is a holiday where I live in Canada. So I will not be at work, nor will the tech team. So we will not see you next Friday, but we will see you the following Friday, which is April 5th. And our special guest is Dr. Alberto Cairo, who is a journalist and a graphic designer, talking about fairness and ethics in data visualization. So hopefully you all will have a good week. I will see you in 2 weeks from now. The Zoom link remains the same. And thank you for coming and being part of our community. We would be nothing without you. And Lina, thank you for taking your very valuable time to share with us your insights and respond so thoughtfully to these really interesting questions.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.